Imagine you're a plumber in the early 1980s. Your day consists of fixing pipes, leaks, blockages, and the occasional install. You probably would have some stories of how gross some people's houses are, or at best, a story about something embarrassing you found clogging someone's pipes. Unless, of course, you happen to be Michael Catran. Michael was a plumber called on February 8, 1983 to investigate the complaints of several tenants at Cranley Gardens. The tenants said that everything was backed up and nothing would flush. When Michael arrived, he immediately found the blockage after opening a drain cover. He found what seemed to be small bits of bone and a strangely fleshy substance. He told a supervisor, and since it was too dark at the time to really see what was going on, they decided that they would wait until the next morning to check it out in detail. A few tenants, Jim Alcock and Dennis Nilsen, had gathered near the plumbers and joked that it looked like someone had been trying to flush Kentucky Fried Chicken down the toilet. The plumbers left, promising to return in the morning. The next day, when Michael and his supervisor returned, they discovered that the drain had been completely cleared of the KFC-like substance. They thought that was a little odd, and they went into the pipe to see if they could find anything else. They were able to find a few more pieces of the fleshy substance as well as some other smaller bones. They thought the bones looked a lot like they could be from a human hand, so they called the police. Thinking back to the night before, they thought that the flesh-like substance could have possibly been human as well. The police transported the bones and fleshy bits to a mortuary where pathologist Professor David Bowen confirmed that the bones and flesh were in fact of human origin. Had someone been flushing human remains down the toilet? Who would be that stupid? How many times has that even happened? Find out who was stupid enough to think that they could flush body parts down the toilet and why he would be referred to as the British Jeffrey Dahmer, among other names, on today's episode of the TM Podcast. Welcome back to the TM Podcast. I am Travis, and I am tired of hearing about the coronavirus, so here's another episode on something scary but not related. I hope every one of you is practicing social distancing and not losing their minds inside. I, unfortunately, or fortunately, have been deemed as an essential employee, so that's something, I guess. Speaking of being bored, I'm sure everyone has already seen Tiger King on Netflix, and if you haven't, please watch it. I know you probably don't want to if you haven't, but please do it. It's one of the most amazing things that I have ever seen, and I'd really like to dig into Carol fucking Baskin and her I most definitely killed my husband type vibe, but not today. Today I'll be talking about Dennis Nilsen and how he helped police catch himself like an absolute dumbass. But first, please remember to like, subscribe, and follow the TM Podcast on whatever it is that you're listening on. And as a quick warning to anyone not aware of this case or to any new listeners, this episode will discuss the murder of young children in detail. If that is not something that you are comfortable with listening to, please browse my catalog of other episodes that do not include children. If you would like a comprehensive list of those episodes, message me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com with the subject line adult, and I promise you that I'll respond. Now let's talk about the Kentucky Fried Flusher, Dennis Nilsen. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, which for those of you listening in the United States is in Scotland and boasts a population of around 15,000. Fun fact about that location is that there are more than 300 castles there. Not relevant at all, I guess, but it's interesting to me. Anyways, Dennis was one of 3 children from parents Elizabeth White and Olav Moksheim. Olav adopted the surname Nilsen, which is of Norwegian origin. He was originally from Norway and moved to Scotland as a soldier in 1940 and was married by 1942. Dennis's parents' marriage was far from great, but nothing like the ones we normally talk about. Olav just didn't take the marriage very seriously, and Elizabeth believes she jumped into the marriage too quickly. Those factors, along with Olav's frequent absence due to his duties as a soldier, led to the couple's divorce in 1948. Dennis Nilsen was described as being a quiet but adventurous child. He would take long walks along the countryside with his mother and other siblings. He looked up to his grandparents, who were always willing to take walks with him and who seemed like very nice and loving people. Dennis viewed his grandfather, specifically, as a hero. He was a fisherman who would take long trips out to sea. Every time he left, Dennis would eagerly await his return and was even quoted as saying that his life seemed empty until his grandfather would return. Unfortunately, on Halloween of 1951, his grandfather died of a heart attack while out at sea. Dennis was absolutely devastated and started to become more and more closed off, only taking walks by himself just to stare out into the ocean. He would just sit with his feet in the water looking out at the boats as if one of them might be bringing his beloved grandfather home. One day in 1954, he decided that he would swim out just a little bit further than he usually does. He went out just a bit too far and was pulled below the surface by the strong currents. He tried to make it back to the surface, but he just couldn't. He claimed to have experienced a moment of absolute tranquility, coming to terms with his death and just letting go. If the story ended here, it would be a sad one. But another young boy had seen him struggling to swim and jumped in, swam out, and saved his life. After that, Elizabeth moved Dennis and his siblings to an apartment and married a man named Andrew Scott. They would move again to another village in Aberdeenshire called Stricken in 1955. As Dennis was growing up, he started to realize that he was not attracted to girls. He kept that a secret, as being openly homosexual in the 50s wasn't exactly the norm. Without anyone to tell, he began to experiment with his feelings by fondling his brother in his sleep. He also admitted to fondling his sister in her sleep as well during this time, but nothing other than that. At 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force, where he had hopes of escaping the lifestyle that his parents lived. He wanted to do better for himself. He followed that path and enlisted in the Army as a cook in 1961. He did his best to hide the fact that he had feelings towards the other men there. For example, he would shower alone so that he wouldn't get aroused, which he believed would happen in the presence of the other males. In 1964, he was stationed in West Germany. He started drinking very heavily when he was there to ease his shyness around his fellow soldiers. He began to develop a fantasy in which he would pass out drunk and his friends would take advantage of him. He would sometimes fake how drunk he was in hopes that that would happen, but it never did. He also started to fantasize about taking advantage of them or any other people that were either too drunk or unconscious. In 1967, he was deployed to the state of Aden in Saudi Arabia and was a cook for the Al Mansoura prison. This place was incredibly dangerous, and at one point Dennis was actually kidnapped by a taxi driver. He was beaten and put in the trunk of a car. When the taxi driver pulled him out, Dennis beat him unconscious with a jack candle. During his time in Saudi Arabia, his fantasies transformed from wanting to have sex with drunkenly passed out people to wanting to have sex with dead people. His most vivid fantasy involved a recently killed soldier being washed by a dirty old man before being taken advantage of. After his deployment, he returned to Britain, where he bounced around a few different bases before ending up in Berlin. This is where he had sex with a woman for the first time. He solicited a prostitute in hopes that the experience would change him in some way, but he said that sex with a female was, quote, overrated and depressing. In the time following this, he was selected to cook for the Queen's Royal Guard, then sent to the Shetland Islands until he ended his military career in 1972. I know that I skipped some of his military time in there, but one thing that I am so curious about, as someone who has served in the United States Army, why in the world do foreign armies bounce around so many times? Most people that I know deploy 4, maybe 5 times and are stationed at less than 5 places in their entire 20 years of service. Every single story that I've ever covered with a foreign army has them bouncing around to like 30 different places in 10 years for some reason. Maybe one of you listening from the UK could help me figure that one out. I don't know. Anyways, after his military service was over, he moved in with his family while he decided what he wanted to do next. It didn't last too long though, as a disagreement between Dennis and his brother over Dennis's sexuality turned into an actual altercation. He decided that since his family couldn't accept him for who he was, he would move to London. While in London, he went through training to become a police officer. He liked the work, but to him, it didn't feel like the army did. He began to drink again, and just to try to get over his shyness, he started hanging out at gay pubs and getting incredibly drunk trying to talk to strangers. He had some casual hookups, but nothing was ever too serious. He eventually decided that police work was not for him, and he quit the force to become a security guard. That role didn't last too long either, and by 1974, he changed careers again to become a civil servant. He would continue this role for several years without incident. From 1974 to 1978, Dennis attempted to have a serious relationship with a man named David. They even moved in together and had the best intentions initially, but over the years, they became distant, eventually seeing other people. By mid-1978, Dennis was alone and back to drinking heavily again. December of 1978, Dennis met a young man named Stephen in a pub. Stephen had tried to buy alcohol but was refused by the bartender for being underage. Dennis told him that he could go home with him and the two could listen to music and he could drink all that he wanted. The young Stephen agreed, and the two spent the evening just as Dennis promised, drinking and listening to music. The next morning, Dennis woke up and noticed Stephen asleep on his bed. In that moment, he decided that Stephen was going to stay with him forever. He grabbed a necktie that he had lying around and strangled Jacob with it. Once he was unconscious, he filled a bucket with water and drowned him in it. He then masturbated over the body before stowing it away underneath his floorboards. The body stayed there for a week, and then he got curious as to how much it had decomposed. He pulled his floorboards up, put the body into his bathtub, washed it off, and put it back. It isn't known how many times he performed that ritual with the body, but after 8 months, he finally pulled the body out for the last time, washed it off, and burned it in his backyard. Stephen Holmes was 14 years old. After burning his body, Dennis realized that he needed to replace it. He lured another man named Andrew Ho into his apartment, promising alcohol and sex. He tried the same mode of strangulation on Andrew, but it didn't work this time. Andrew was actually able to fight off Dennis and get away. He called police to report what had happened, but ultimately decided not to press any charges. This decision would leave Dennis on the streets to hunt for another victim. He didn't waste much time as he met a tourist named Kenneth O'Kendon while out drinking again. Dennis lured Kenneth away from the bar by telling him that he would show him some of the famous landmarks around London. After his quick tour, he convinced him to go back to his place so that they can continue drinking. When in Dennis's home, he choked Kenneth to death with some headphones that he had been listening to music with. Unlike his first victim, he took several pictures of the body, posing him in different ways all over his room. When he became bored of that, he wrapped his body in plastic and put it under the floor. Whenever Dennis would get bored or lonely, he would pull Kenneth's body back out from under the floor and sit it up in a chair beside him so that he could have company while he watched TV and drank. He moved on to his next kill in May of 1980. He met a 16-year-old hitchhiker named Martin Duffy on his way back from a work conference. He took him to his house, offering him a place to stay for the night. As soon as he fell asleep, Dennis sat on his chest and choked him unconscious. He then drowned him in his kitchen sink. After the boy was dead, Dennis took a bath with the body before masturbating on him and stuffing him in the cupboard. Obviously, putting the body there without wrapping it caused it to decompose quicker, and Dennis decided that it needed to go into the floor right alongside Kenneth. After this murder, Dennis Nilsen picked up the pace. He went from just 3 murders in 2 years to a total of 8 in just a few short months. He would use the same MO each time. Convince someone to come drink with him, then strangle them, drown them, bathe them, and then masturbate on him and shove them under his floorboard. This created an obvious problem. Eventually, those bodies started to decay to the point of rot. No matter how much deodorant and fragrances he sprayed, it still stank. He even started trying to spray insecticides under the floor, hoping that it would slow the spread of bugs trying to eat the bodies, but nothing would work. He had to remove them all, cut them up, and burn them in a bonfire. He threw an old car tire on top of it just so the smell wouldn't cause any suspicion. With all that empty space under his floorboard after he burned the bodies, he decided he wanted to fill it up again. So he went on to kill at least 4 more men and put them right back in the place, wrapping them a little tighter in hopes that they wouldn't decay as fast as the last bodies. In September of 1981, Dennis noticed a man leaned up against the wall of his house in distress. The man was 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow, and he informed Dennis that his legs had become weak after taking some medicine. Dennis called an ambulance for him and waited at his side until they took him away. The next day, the man came knocking on the door, wanting to thank him for calling an ambulance and potentially saving his life. Dennis invited him in, cooked him dinner, and gave him some rum to drink. Malcolm unfortunately fell asleep, and you guessed it, Dennis strangled him to death for no fucking reason. Not sure why he wouldn't have done that the day before, but I guess he thought the man coming back was some sort of sign that he needed to kill him. Soon after the death of Malcolm, Dennis's landlord decided that he wanted to renovate the property, so Dennis had to find a new place to live. Before he moved out, he made sure to have another big bonfire to rid the property of any traces of his last few victims. Dennis ended up finding an available apartment at Cranley Gardens. The downside of his new place was the fact that he had no backyard to burn bodies in. But it didn't stop him. He would go on to kill another man, 23-year-old John Howlett. Instead of putting the body on the floor, he decided to cut it up and store the pieces in various places around the apartment. Just a few short months later, he attempted to kill another man, 21-year-old Carl Stoddard. He tried to choke him to death, but for some reason, he could not kill him. He even tried drowning him, but it didn't work. When Carl came to, Dennis convinced him that he had gotten tangled up in his sleeping bag and almost choked himself to death. The drunk Carl didn't even realize that Dennis had actually tried to kill him, and Carl went on his way, not knowing how close he actually was to becoming a victim. Dennis didn't skip a beat, killing two other men, cutting them up, and placing them in cabinets, dressers, drawers, and anywhere that he could fit them. He decided that he needed to get rid of some of them as, like before, they started to stink. He decided that he would remove the flesh and the smaller bones and organs and just flush them down the toilet. He found that if you boiled the hands, feet, and the head, the skin would peel off a lot easier. He was getting pretty good at this, he thought. But there was a problem. After a few bodies, his toilet wouldn't flush as well anymore. He tried to fix it himself, but it seemed like the whole system was backed up. He became upset and did what might be the dumbest thing that I have ever heard in any serial killer case that I have ever researched, ever. He wrote a formal complaint letter to the property management about how unacceptable the plumbing was. And that takes us to where we started this story, February 8th, 1983. The plumber Michael and his supervisor show up to investigate, finding the clog immediately. Dennis himself jokes to them that it must be KFC. The next day, as you already know, the police got involved and verified that the clog was the result of human remains being flushed down a toilet. Further investigation pointed to the top floor apartment of Dennis Nilsen as the likely origin of the remains. The police waited by the door of the apartment for Dennis to get home from work. When he arrived, they told him they needed to speak with him in his apartment, so he let him right in. As soon as they walked in, they smelled death. Dennis played dumb for a minute, but when they pressed a little, he admitted that there were still human remains in the apartment. He admitted that he wanted to get it all off his chest, and he was ready to go to jail. When they asked him how many people that he had killed, he told the officers, quote, 15 or 16 since 1978. When they searched his apartment, they found plastic bags with dissected torsos and internal organs, as well as arms, a skull, and a severed head that had been boiled. A separate search turned up a few legs, random bones, another torso, and an additional head. Dennis told police about his previous address, where they would go on to find all kinds of bone fragments from his bonfire. He would go on to confess to every murder that he committed since 1978 in vivid enough detail that the police confirmed most of them easily. He would go on to tell them with some of his victims he not only drowned or choked them and played around with their bodies for company, but he also engaged in necrophilia. He said that he wasn't sure why he killed or what his motive ever was. He claimed to take no pride in killing, but he was unable to stop. And he did what a lot of serial killers do and try to pretend like murder and death and the dead bodies were some form of art to try to incite sympathy from other people, but just like with other cases, it doesn't work. During his trial, he went through a strange charade of firing his public defender only to take him back and fire him again, and that would happen a few times before ultimately he allowed the public defender to represent him as he pled not guilty by reason of insanity or impaired mental function. The trial was pretty lengthy, as when the news broke of the murders, people started coming forward admitting that Dennis had attacked them as well, but like the first failed murder of Andrew Ho, they didn't press any charges. Two separate psychiatrists evaluated Dennis's mental state to see if his claim of insanity had any chance of being true. They concluded that he could only act in anger due to a lack of emotional development, as well as an association with dead bodies and sexual arousal, likely being a result of an impaired sense of identity. They believed he did not view people as people, just objects, as he possessed plenty of narcissistic traits. They believed that he suffered from an unspecified personality disorder. One psychiatrist said that even in making that evaluation, he was undecided on whether or not he believed Dennis to be fully responsible for his actions, whereas the other stated that due to the issues with his development and personality disorder, he should have at least reduced responsibility of these crimes. After a bunch of back and forth between the defense and prosecution about his mental state and level of responsibility, the jury finally concluded that he was guilty of 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He would be sentenced to life imprisonment for his charges with a minimum of 25 years to be served. This would later be upgraded to life without parole. Unlike most serial killers, he never entered an appeal at all. He fully accepted that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He was attacked once and needed some stitches, but other than that, he spent the rest of his life there without incident. He would die due to a pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage in 2018, and I'm sure that I said that wrong. There are many other elements of Dennis's story that I hear in other stories and podcasts and on YouTube about this case that I could really not verify. So if you know this story well and wonder why I didn't cover something, that's why. I try my best to not over-sensationalize these by throwing information in that may or may not be true. At the end of all this, it is known for sure that he killed 12 people, but the number could be as many as 16. The victims of Dennis Nilsen are as follows: Stephen Holmes, 14 years old; Kenneth O'Kendon, 23; Martin Duffy, 16; William Sutherland, 26; Malcolm Barlow, 23; John Howlett, 23; Graham Allen, 27; Stephen Sinclair, 20. There are 7 other unidentified males. Dennis didn't focus on the names of his victims, but it is odd that he started and ended with the victims of the same name, Stephen. I like to go over the names at the end of the episode because it's far more important to remember the names of innocent people than it is to remember the names of the people that hurt them. Do you think there are more names on this list? Do you think that there's more to this story? Do you think that he basically called the police on himself on purpose? Or do you think that he was that stupid? Let me know what you think by commenting on this episode or emailing me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. If you'd like to decide who I talk about next and have access to exclusive content that is not available anywhere else, head on over to patreon.com/thetmpodcast and become a patron. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me on whatever you're listening on. And once again, thank you for listening to the TM Podcast.